They always said the desert keeps what it swallows, but tonight it returns something that feels less like an artifact and more like an answer waiting to be asked. When the stone hatch finally sighs open, the air is not ancient. It is recent, electric, as if the tomb exhaled an unfinished equation. We tell ourselves we are only witnesses, gloved, catalogued, cautious. But we lean in anyway. The mask sits where a face should be, metal dark, polished by no hand we know, reflecting stars that are not above us. Samir's camera hums, Mateo jokes about curses, and Owen laughs at a frequency that doesn't sound human. I want to call it coincidence when the ground begins to tick like cooling iron. I want to, but the rhythm is too precise, the intervals too familiar. I've heard this pattern before, in recordings that traveled billions of miles and came back changed. We have touched older things without consequence. Potsherds, cartouches weathered into silence, bones that remember the shape of grief, but not its voice. This is different. The mask doesn't feel found. It feels awake. Anders calls it piezoelectric nonsense. Amina refuses to step closer, and her refusal reads truer than his certainty. Owen hears colors again, he says, and what he hears is blue, the kind that stains your teeth in dream. NASA shouldn't be part of this story, and yet Ruth keeps pacing the perimeter like an orbit decaying. She listens to us, and to someone else far away. We catalog each tick because cataloging is how you tame fear, but the rhythm outpaces the list. It starts describing us back. When Mateo jokes again, the punchline lands exactly on the beat, and no one laughs. The first call to the array station is a courtesy. Do you see this too? Whispered across satellites. Behind Ruth's clipped questions, the operator's voice slows, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. They ask for coordinates, then for time stamps, then for skin contact duration, a phrase that tastes wrong. We feed them numbers. They feed us silence punctuated by breath and the scratch of pens. Samir films our hands instead of our faces, and later I will understand why. Hands betray alignment first. Fingers tap in unison. Thumbs curl on the same beat. The sun climbs. Heat scrubs detail from the dunes. And still the trench feels refrigerated. When the array calls back, they don't say, confirmed. They say, it's replying. Multiple echoes hold position, as if we could hold still inside an answered prayer. We move the mask to a neutral table because ritual feels safer when disguised as procedure. Noor translates the shallow grooves as breaths, though the word is a guess, and she hates to guess. Anders swears the pulses are seismic interference from a mine 200 kilometers south, an explanation with no rhythm and no mercy. Owen's headset crackles with a harmonic he calls ultramarine, and the color leaks into his voice. Amina watches from the shade, mouth pinched away from comment. Ruth asks us to limit direct contact. Mateo signs a waiver with a smile that can't find his eyes. The desert heat thickens, flies vortex around the awnings, and a thin line of salt forms on our lips as if the earth itself is preserving us for later. The touch that changes everything is almost gentle. Mateo lays his palm flat, as if calming a feral dog, and for a heartbeat, nothing happens. Then the camp goes quiet, the way a theater hushes before a curtain. Sound doesn't stop. It arranges itself. The generator settles into a perfect tone. The flies lift and hang like punctuation, and Owen turns toward the salt flats with tears he doesn't feel. In Ruth's headset, far cities lean closer. The mask doesn't glow, doesn't flare. It draws light into its contours and returns it as a map our eyes can't parse. The pulse that leaves the table is small enough to miss and large enough to reach orbit. Somewhere above us, an instrument we'll never see decides we've spoken first and answers in kind. We don't hear the reply, but our bones do. We begin to measure the way fear prefers a spreadsheet. The pulse that startled us at dawn becomes a column of numbers. then several, then an atlas of correspondences no one requested. Heart rates sharpen into ladders of prime intervals. Ambient noise, once a friendly hiss, crystallizes into steps that skip like stones across a pond. The sand near the work tables answers a metronome we don't own. Someone jokes about pareidolia, but the joke arrives on time, as if scheduled. We swap out instruments, replace batteries, rotate personnel, and the rhythm follows each control like a loyal dog. When the array inland pings us for raw feeds, we send everything. BIOS audio, accelerometer traces even the hour's throwaway chat. In the playback, the smallest sounds, shoelaces dragged, pages turned, become harmonics of a larger phrase, and the phrase refuses to be background. It keeps stepping closer. Outside, the basin pretends its stillness, but under the crust, the salt behaves like a drumhead. We grid the flats with cheap sensors and expensive hope, staking corners, tying twine, labeling flags. The first sweep looks random until we change the time window. Then a ringed pattern resolves, expanding in polite, evenly spaced size. At each ripple's edge, devices misbehave in a single shared direction. Compasses flirt west, microphones mute and return. Cameras drop a frame, but keep their timing. The grooves on the stone table earn a new translation. Not breaths, but rests. A notation for absence that conducts presence. We test distance, proximity, occlusion. We try linen, foil, leather, raw skin. The closer flesh draws, the tidier the geometry becomes, as though the phenomenon finds in us a truer ruler. It is not flattering to learn you make the signal cleaner. By afternoon, absence is harder than presence to ignore. We cut power, silence the generator, unplug every charger like penitence. The desert replies anyway, politely relentless. A test recording made with nothing but a plastic pen clipped to an upturned bowl reproduces the same laddered ticks, now softer, intimate, as if crouched close to our ears. An inland receiver forwards overlays against historic telemetry we didn't ask to see. The match isn't exact, but it is familial. A surname shared with something that left home before our grandparents were born. We argue about selection bias and find ourselves picking the same words at the same moment. The mask waits on its padded throne, indifferent to custody. It never vibrates when we touch it. It calibrates. The difference sounds pedantic until you feel your pulse shift to meet a beat that wasn't yours an hour ago. The body becomes an instrument reluctantly. We wear fingertip sensors, strap on chest bands, surrender saliva to sterile vials. When we step back from the table, the traces loosen like a braid undone. When we edge forward, they cinch into time. A thermal camera finds a cool halo pooling around the object, colder than shadow, the kind of cold that suggests intention rather than weather. Grain by grain, dust arranges into faint ridges that line up with the faintest throb underfoot. We keep proposing machinery, mines, military, pranksters with a transmitter, and too much boredom, and keep killing those proposals with the elegance of the pattern. The historian refuses to step within the chalk circle we've drawn. She claims the circle marks respect, but her eyes make a different claim. That boundaries comfort the living more than they restrain the dead. Evidence asks for escalation, and escalation pretends to be caution. We build a crude Faraday tent from copper mesh and optimism, threading seams with wire while the wind licks the canvas like a cat's tongue. The plan is simple. Deny the world and see what remains. Before we power down, we log one more proximity curve. The graph climbs with a grace that feels almost proud. Inside the shield, the silence is thicker, and with it, the beat grows more intimate, like a whisper leaning into the ear. Our data doesn't flatten, it refines, losing the clutter of distance until only pulse and reply remain. Braided close enough to be mistaken for one, the impression settles that we have not invited contact but confirmed attendance. When the inland receiver calls again, it is not to ask for numbers. It is to ask who, exactly, is doing the responding. The inland array takes ownership with the confidence of people whose machines have already outlived their builders. On a secure channel, a clipped voice asks for sweeps at precise hand distances, 1 centimeter, 5, 10, and the metronome that haunts our camp obliges as if auditioning for their protocol. They overlay returns from a craft that has not seen sunlight since the Carter years and find a kinship that is not identity but blood relation. The cadence modulates when skin nears metal, not louder, only cleaner, shedding noise like a freshly honed blade. We speak in numbers because adjectives feel superstitious. Still, someone whispers that the reply is polite. The array requests a final pass, 3 touches at fixed durations. We oblige, and somewhere between the second and third contact, a checksum lands squarely where no checksum belongs, inside the small, stubborn pulse beneath the wrist. Cross-correlation turns into confession. The archive unspools decades of distant whispers, and the present replies by correcting them. Where the ancient signal stutters, our feed supplies the missing beat. Where it drifts, our proximity nails it to time. The linguist in the tent hesitates before calling it grammar, but the hesitation sounds theatrical. On a shared screen, annotations bloom. Prime clusters, mirrored intervals, an elegant refusal of randomness. When the biosensors are muted, the phrase. When a bare palm rests on the metal, clauses return with a patience that feels like teaching. We stop arguing about origin and start arguing about intent, which is another way of admitting we've granted it. The array asks for an unnatural act. Hold contact until the rhythm does not hurt. The request lands like a ritual disguised as science, and science reaches for the disguise. Distance is supposed to be the enemy of clarity, but separation cleans the line until it gleams. The inland dishes steer away from planets and down toward us, and the world's noise obligingly steps aside. In that hush, the reply reveals a structure we have been too close to hear. A call that expects a shared body to stabilize it. We test decoys. Metal masks cast in haste, conductive mannequins, a handprint plate, and each fails with a gracelessness that embarrasses our cleverness. The pattern wants the specific flaws of living tissue: pulse variability, micro-tremor, the slow tidal swing of breath. A report arrives stamped with fatigue and awe. The reply bears a signature tied to the geometry of the skull, as if the antenna it respects is not the hand, but the head behind it. We all glance away from mirrors. When contact becomes duration, duration becomes a corridor. Holding until the ache smooths, the volunteer rides through an unpleasantness that starts in the wrist and blooms behind the eyes. Mouths go dry, breath counts itself, and then relief, like a pressure gradient equalizing. The reply settles into nested periods, long and short, a metrical ladder, more sung than spoken. The array maps those periods against star positions and gets nonsense. Mapped against our movements, the nonsense snaps into choreography. Direction enters the room not as arrows, but as leanings. A call to stand here, then here, to face this way, to turn the head by a degree that feels trivial and is not. We obey without naming it obedience, and watch the graphs reward posture with precision. The suspicion grows that we are not receiving telemetry. We are being posed. Inquiry earns the right to ask one unscientific question. If this is a reply to what was the first hello, the archive offers a candidate older than our camp, older than our careers, a stray harmonized scrap in a Voyager transmission that nobody flagged because it was barely there and perfectly deniable. Now, it is neither. The dishes, the mask, the body. 3 points define a plane, and on that plane, the phrase completes. No maps resolve from it. No coordinates share themselves. Instead, the completed cadence leaves a residue of directionless urgency, like standing at a door that is already ajar. The liaison's voice loses its armor for one sentence. Hold position until we can move you. we realize with a shiver of practical dread that we have asked the sky a question we can only answer by going down. Sleep stops being private. It becomes a corridor we all walk in single file, even when our bodies lie in separate cots, and the night claims to be empty. The pulse that taught us to listen now teaches cadence to eyelids and breath. We do not mean to mimic it, yet we wake with tongues pressed to the roof of our mouths like students holding syllables. The lamps dim and surge in sympathetic steps that none of us scheduled. Amina refuses rest, muttering that doors should be watched when they decide to open themselves. Anders writes equations hard enough to rip the paper and pretends he cannot hear what we hear. The mask sits within its circle, apparently still, but in recordings its orientation drifts by an angle so slight we would have called it wind. If the fabric walls weren't nailed still, if the sand didn't hush as if waiting for us to finish our turn. Or finish our turn. Morning discredits the comfort of daylight. The pulse remains but grows coy, stepping behind ordinary noises so that we discover it in mundane actions. Zipper teeth, spoon taps, the irregular cluck of a cooling kettle. We keep our hands to ourselves until impatience pretends to be bravery. Touch now returns not with the earlier ache, but with a sensation like standing under a very tall ceiling, aware of volume without seeing. Nor calls the grooves, rests again, and then, reluctant, upgrades the word. Rests that direct phrasing. She traces the lengths with knuckles and stops when her knuckles tremble. The liaison's voice narrows through the headset. We are to record, to refrain, to wait for an all clear that tastes imaginary. Meanwhile, our blinking keeps trying to agree. Our footsteps fall into new unanimities, and the shade line by noon looks like a boundary someone else designed. Contagion is not sickness but choreography. We film ourselves to prove independence and instead discover a room full of mirrors. Conversations stagger into call and response, and jokes land in identical cadence no matter who tells them. A shadow appears on footage where no one stood. A denser patch of dusk crossing the tent wall in time with the most skeptical words. Anders, who does not believe in choreography, finds the metronome setting on his wristwatch changed without touch, and refuses to say who changed it. Amina begins to speak to the mask as one addresses a stranger on the threshold. Welcome if you mean well. Leave if you do not. The phrase feels childish, and yet the tent shivers once, exactly on her syllables, as if acknowledging a preferred tempo. We take turns denying what we see. Denial arrives punctually, like a train. Night brings mercy in the way a tide withdraws to reveal wreckage. With the generator idled and phones sleeping in a steel ammo box, the site becomes a clock of bodies. We place the mask back on its bier in the tomb to break its line of sight with the sky, and for a moment, the world loosens. Then Owen, who hears blue, goes still enough to imitate silence, and the relief curdles. The tomb's air cools our throats. Stone sweats a mineral chill that reads like breath. We stand too long without speaking, and in that longness a new modulation arrives. Fine as down, felt before measured. It is not louder. It is closer. The realization comes from no instrument. The reply does not care where the mask is stored if one of us stands near it. We have mistaken proximity's axis. The line of sight is through bone. We try an experiment that is not on any form. Doubt aloud together. Each of us speaks a version of dismissal. Coincidence, interference, fatigue. And the reply arranges itself around those refusals like ivy finding a wall. The mask seems impossibly to angle toward the last speaker every time, a politeness that chills more than any threat. Then comes the shared blink, the one we cannot unsee. Every face turned toward the object closes and opens in the same slow, respectful beat, as if sealing an oath. The liaison orders the tomb sealed for the night. The stone door grinds home, and quiet returns with the weight of an audience waiting at intermission. We leave a camera rolling because we no longer trust absence. Hours later on playback, the sealed chamber shows nothing moving except a shadow crossing the mask, changing nothing but the direction it faces, which is toward the lens. The decision to go down arrives disguised as procedure. Verify stability, map airflow, log mineral content. What we are really measuring is permission. The sealed door answers our push with a sigh that could be relief, and the passage beyond descends at a slope our legs accept before our minds do. The pulse thins to a filament we wear behind the eyes, less sound than suggestion, guiding boots to stone in intervals that feel rehearsed. We move in a line. The skeptic, the keeper of stories, the listener, the recorder, the one responsible for consequences, each of us performing a role. The chamber seems to anticipate. Breath becomes metronome. Even fear arranges itself to time. When the corridor kinks into a dogleg that should starve light, the headlamps do not dim. They clarify, as if the walls prefer to be seen. We tell ourselves we are exploring. Descent knows better. The first room greets us by refusing to be a room. Angles meet without behaving. Corners imply distance that the next step denies. A soft resonance hums in the stone like a bell. Someone refuses to strike fully, letting partials bloom instead. We test with the oldest instrument, Silos, and find it answered by a faint return invisibly mapped to our positions. Standing here changes that echo. Turning the head changes it again. We mark the floor with chalk, and the chalk lines curve into arcs we did not draw. The grooves nor named become apparent in the architecture, not on a slab, but across the walls, shallow channels that might have been carved by water, if water could count. We do not place the mask on a pedestal. We hold it because the air suggests that is the correct grammar. When it cools against skin, the room clears its throat. When contact resumes, it does not arrive like a switch, but like a horizon, creeping forward until it is everywhere at once. A coolness travels up the arm and nests behind the brow, and the cadence we learned in daylight now unfurls in a slower register that treats time like clay. The walls answer with overlapping rings. Each returns slightly out of phase until the mask smooths them into a single patient chord. We discover a simple cruelty. The better we align our bodies, the clearer the structure becomes. The skeptic becomes a tuning fork despite himself. The historian plants her feet as if the floor expects ceremony. The liaison's shoulders square into a posture that reads like oath. On the recorder, the chord blooms into branching intervals that refuse Euclid, curving space into an address that is not map or language, but a way to place a head. Projection, when it happens, rejects the shallow theater of light. It does not paint surfaces, it persuades them. The channels brighten from within as if mineral remembered a hotter making, and the hum divides into stair steps that climb and fold, a lattice of periods grown in 3 dimensions. RCS interlock overhead, mapping a geometry that instructs rather than depicts. We try to photograph it and produce only honest lies, frames that look like diagrams of weather or of veins, never the thing itself, but standing in it writes clarity into bone. Our positions become coordinates, our nods and breath the toggles that advance the phrase. When the final intervals settle, the shape presses into the room like a second room superimposed. A corridor not dug but requested. Stone that has no right to move gives way the way a throat does to a learned name. Address accepted? The chamber changes key. The hum drops until it can only be felt in teeth, and the air thins the way it does before a storm. We approach the newly yielded opening not as conquerors, but as understudies summoned on short notice. Inside the threshold, darkness behaves. It does not swallow the light so much as set terms for it. The mask cools another degree, and every lamp steadies without flicker, a courtesy that reads like invitation. We have pursued answers and reached a door that is not ours, yet our breathing fits the tempo of entry as if taught long ago. On the last check before we cross, the recorder catches a faint double, our pulse and its echo, aligned so cleanly they read as one. We do not call it safe. We call it necessary. We step through, knowing some measures only play once. The corridor beyond the aperture refuses echo, and yet amplifies intent. We test it with the smallest things. A held breath, a counted blink, the flex of a wrist above cool metal. Each gesture comes back edited, neater than we made it, as if corrected by a patient teacher. The liaison's radio coughs to life without static. No call sign, only timing, a ladder of long and short that fits the cadence we have learned like a glove. We arrange ourselves by accident into a curve that the walls seem ready to accept, and watch instruments settle. As though relieved, we finally remembered the sequence. We have learned not to ask if this is safe. We ask instead whether it is complete. The answer lives in the lighting. Headlamps dim in measured steps, not failing but yielding. And the corridor takes responsibility for illumination with a silver that feels borrowed from bone. Transmission requires a sender, and the room is choosy. We rotate contact like a secular liturgy. Gloved, bare, gloved. And each time the phrase improves, then phrase. When the listener places his palm, the air tightens with attention. The cadence we chased in dust and salt returns with the composure of something that has been waiting. Faint pulses march the corridor like unseen footfalls. Nearby, a coil of wire on a crate lifts and settles as if breathing. The inland array, patched through by a voice that refuses to introduce itself, asks for a sustained hold. To comfort the carrier. The words should offend. Instead, they clarify. We are instruments, and one of us plays true. The others learn the grace of stepping back, of becoming dampers, while a single body becomes the note. The reply lengthens, stops pretending to be noise, and finally speaks in intervals alone. The room requests posture the way a conductor lifts a hand. Chin by a degree, shoulders down. Breath counted not as discipline but as dialogue. When the count reaches 5, the lights answer. Not a strobe in panic, but a sequence that writes itself across the walls. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Pauses, then continues, a ladder we recognize with a dread that is mostly awe. It spills outward. Wrist leads, the distant sodium lamp at the mouth of the tomb, the tiny tally on our camera. Each joins the sequence as though drafted. The inland station reports the same pattern in their ceiling grid and pretends not to be afraid. We mark each luminous beat and find it mirrored in the pulse at the wrist it does not own. Contact deepens without pressure. The listener becomes less a person touching an object than a hinge between two well-mannered clocks agreeing on noon. The experiment stops being ours when the signal stops pretending it needs our consent. The phrase complicates, folding into nested periods that hinge on the listener's micro-tremor. He is not harmed. He is used with a gentleness that frightens more than violence would. The array says their dishes see a shape in delay space that looks like a corridor turned inside out. The liaison repeats the words without understanding, and still makes them sound like orders. We speak softly, though we are not sure sound matters. The corridor darkens everywhere except around the hand, where a pale corona persists, and with it a pressure in the sinuses like descending for landing. When we attempt to break contact, the cadence lingers in the skin, a respectful afterimage, like a hand reluctant to let go of a handshake that mattered. When reply becomes instruction, instruction becomes address. The rhythm walks us backward through everything we named. Not star charts, but postures. Not coordinates, but consent. The final sequence descends rather than climbs, a courteous diminuendo that implies we have finished the phrase correctly. The inland station, their lights still counting, asks us to break contact on the next prime and hold still for nothing. We do. The silence does not arrive. Instead, a pressure eases like weather changing rooms. The corridor's radiance softens into a memory of light. The listener steps away unharmed and newly unalone, his pulse wearing an echo that does not entirely belong to him. The object rests, not off, but done. We gather our instruments and discover we are the instruments, and that something out there has tuned us. The only question left has no number in it, whether we returned what we borrowed. As we back out of the corridor, the rhythm does not chase us. It accompanies, like a guide who has already shown the landmarks and trusts us to remember the path. The felt pressure lifts in polite degrees, leading behind a hush that is not absence but aftermath. Instruments pretend at normal. Readouts flatten, fans resume irregularity. The cheap pen's sympathetic rattle goes still, yet breath still counts itself, and steps still search for the remembered beats. The recorder, played back in a nervous cluster on the salt, reveals our voices gentled by a timing we never agreed to but obeyed anyway. The liaison inventories what cannot be inventoried, assigning chain of custody to seconds. The historian watches the horizon as if it might blink. The skeptic rubs his wrist like a muscle has learned a word. We raised a reply from stone and distance, and now the only remaining ceremony is return. Daylight makes a brief case for amnesia before the orbiting world interrupts. The array's voice has lost its institutional polish. What remains is bafflement dressed as procedure. They have mapped the cadence we supplied against archives and found not a location but a behavior, a way of arranging attention that shouldn't transmit and yet did, onto their ceiling lights, their server fans, the breath of a bored technician several continents away. They ask for retention. The liaison answers with law. They ask for another pass. The corridor has already closed. The historian insists on the desert's older rule. What is taken must be returned by the rhythm in which it was found. No one argues, not even the skeptic. We prepare the beer, clean the grooves, and promise ourselves this is containment, not surrender. Above us, machines that never sleep wait for a signal that will not come from the sky. Return is choreography disguised as humility. We match the earlier sequence without speaking it, feet finding the same intervals, shoulders settling into known angles, breath counting a measured 5 that now feels like farewell. The beer accepts weight with the resigned creak of something fulfilling its design. When skin lifts from metal, the pulse does not flare, but diminishes respectfully, a dimmer sliding to evening. The tense panels slacken, flies forget their formation. The generator resumes its petty human drift. We wait for punishment and are offered recess. The liaison signs the custody forms with a hand that does not tremble. The historian murmurs, a line no microphone catches. The skeptic laughs once, a quiet exhale that aches. We close the tomb with a care that stops short of reverence, and the world, obedient, relieved, goes briefly, beautifully, ordinary. Silence holds until it doesn't. Evening leans across the basin and the surface of the flats, which all day mimicked calm, begins to tick like cooling glass, too soft to hear, too orderly to mistake. The array calls in a rush. Their instruments have gone obedient again, not to an uplink but to a geometry projected where we stand. On the salt, a pattern inscribes itself in powder-fine ridges, an asterism no catalog contains, not overhead but underfoot. Each ridge stands at a height set by breath, and a spacing set by heart. And when we step, we ruin it. When we hold still, it completes. We recognize nothing and understand everything. The reply was never in the sky. It is here, mapping a vault buried in salt and time, charting stars that never rose because they were laid down. The historian laughs, delighted and afraid. The skeptic forgets to argue. Reckoning rarely feels like thunder. It feels like a rune choosing its final line and trusting us to carry it. The flats keep their quiet stars until the first true ones appear above, at which point the ground's constellation fades with courtesy, as if refusing redundancy. The array, baffled beyond protocol, files their report under phenomena and their fear under private habits. We log and pack and leave the tomb sealed, convinced that ceiling is not what keeps anything in or out. On the last night, wind returns and the camp remembers how to be ordinary. Lights flutter, pots rattle. A zipper misbehaves. The listener's pulse no longer double tracks, but sometimes his breath waits for a downbeat that isn't there. We drive away in a staggered convoy and do not look back until the horizon makes a mirror of heat. Far behind, something inhales, not ours to answer, and the desert keeps it.